loneliness?
It's a word that describes a person's mental state, perception of self, and a type of pain, all in that one word. And Emily Dickinson was no stranger to the theme of loneliness in her poetry.
It might be lonelier without the loneliness. I'm so accustomed to my fate, perhaps the other peace. In such a place, what horror! How goblin would it be and fly as 'twere pursuing you? Then loneliness looks so. The loneliness one dare not sound, and would as soon surmise as in its grave go plumbing to ascertain the size. I fear me this is loneliness, the maker of the soul. Its caverns and its corridors illuminate or seal. There is another loneliness that many die without. Not want of friend occasions it, or circumstance of lot.
But perhaps most core to the idea of loneliness is the absence of the other, of an other, of any other. And there is one Emily Dickinson poem that longs for an other even more than any of the other 1,774 of her poems.
I tried to think a lonelier thing than any I had seen, some polar expiation, an omen in the bone of death's tremendous nearness. I probed retrieveless things, my duplicate to borrow, a haggard comfort springs from the belief that somewhere, within the clutch of thought, there dwells one other creature of heavenly love forgot. I plucked at our partition as one should pry the walls between himself and horror's twin within opposing cells. I almost strove to clasp his hand, such luxury. It grew that as myself could pity him, perhaps he pitied me.
A loneliness that is so dire that it forces our speaker to manifest some other. An other that is still all too distant.
In his introduction to Emily Dickinson in The Best Poems of the English Language from Chaucer to Robert Frost, Harold Bloom says, quote, "She has no good news to proclaim. Despair, mourning and melancholia, psychic pain, erotic suffering, these are her materia poetica. But where could so extraordinary a spirit hope to find her equal?"
Where, indeed? Not now.
And because in that same introduction Bloom proclaims, quote, "Dickinson's poetry looks simple and is very difficult. She is so cognitively original that she challenges William Blake in that regard. William Shakespeare's powers of thought, quite aside from all his other gifts, are unmatchable in literature and in language. Dickinson, at her strongest, has something in her lyrics that recalls the swiftness and compression of Shakespeare's mind. Let's take just a second to kind of recap just what is happening on the page here. Our speaker's conceit is trying to envision and maybe to conjure in this way something lonelier than anything she had ever seen, intimating that surely this thing would be on some level indissoluble from death. Here, our speaker paints the picture of sending out some type of psychic force to find this loneliness, finally admitting that this search is in hope for comfort from that other. She, too, is lonely. Here, our speaker fantasizes that somewhere else there is a someone just as lonely, possibly engaging in this very same exercise. Upon finding this individual alone, obviously, in his own room, now purposed as a prison cell, our speaker tries to get to this fresh other. Finally, our speaker stops herself from reaching out to the creature comfort of this lonely other's hand before reaching the climactic realization.
Far out, man. But what are we actually talking about here?
Hardcore, awesome, great, cool. Now, let's take this sort of step by step. And we have to start with the observation that our speaker is searching for a thing lonelier than any she had seen. And in this, it is assumed that loneliness has seen some relationship. Loneliness itself has its roots close to death itself. And why might that inference be drawn? Well, it's because of this. We have our of heavenly love forgot line here, which seems very strange. It's kind of a weirdly worded thing. We're talking about loneliness. There's no real deep religious invocation here prior to this line. But this line has its roots in original sin. In the Bible, Adam and Eve are in the Garden of Eden, and upon committing sin, they are cast out. Cool. Then they have a couple of sons, Cain and Abel. Maybe you've heard of them. In a fit of jealous rage, Cain kills Abel, committing the first murder, after which there is a further casting out. Now, when Adam and Eve were cast out of the Garden of Eden, they were cast out away from God. And then they were left in the company of each other, in the company of man. And then we have Cain killing Abel, where he is cast out away from the company even of man. And in this moment, Cain replies, "Behold, thou hast driven me out this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face shall I be hid. I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth." Thus, Dickinson links this deep loneliness to the faulted and sinful soul itself. This casting out, this loneliness is the sign not just of absence from God, but of absence from humankind. Our individual here is assuming on the self that she has been cast out, perhaps necessitating that the only thing I tried to a lonely thing, the only thing lonelier. This necessitates that the only thing which could by definition be lonelier is another human being, raising the question, is loneliness the sole domain of human beings? But our speaker, look, upon finding someone lonelier than herself, our speaker scurries deeper for an intimate relationship, for intimacy, scurries deeper before stopping short. I almost strove to clasp her. I plucked at our partition. Our speaker wants a closer relationship. I almost strove to clasp it. Almost strove, but did not. The revelation that she pities him, that as myself could pity him, she pities him, perhaps he could pity me. Now, why is that? Why are we stopping short there? Why should not only does she stop herself short, the entire poem ends here. The entire poem ends with this realization that as myself could pity him, perhaps he pitied me. Why should the poem have to stop here? I think maybe there are two possibilities, but surprise, neither of them is particularly cuddly. The number one thing that I think might be going on here is that these individuals, being so secluded as they are, perhaps merely the recognition of each other's suffering is enough to sustain them for now. They've had enough for the day. They realize there is something out there as lonely as them, so they stopped. In this interpretation, it is tempting to dream that there is another meeting at some point between these two individuals where maybe they share some other morsel of connection, perhaps some dialogue. Maybe they reach out through the mental cogitations and touch. This means that there is more than their loneliness out there, and their mutual loneliness grows in the wake of this event. But the number two idea that I have as to why does this poem stop here, the darkest of Emily Dickinson's poems, if I may say so myself, why would it stop here? Well, what if our speaker had never envisioned anyone else pitying them? And the poem ends here because upon this realization, she is embarrassed and ashamed at being pitiable, at being so pitiful, perhaps considering herself in this moment pathetic and seen as such. Maybe that is what is going on. And so, this cognitive catwalk betwixt our outcasts is severed, never to be sought out again as our speaker slinks away in shame. Maybe this poem ends where it does, ends where it is, because our speaker has realized she is pitiful. She sees this other person being so pitiful as he is, realizes that that is her as well, and has become ashamed. Therefore, these two of the loneliest things realize in this moment not only how they look, not only that they are pitiful, not only that their lives have led them to being so alone, but now they are too far gone. There is no reclamation to be had. They are too far gone. They are never to touch again. They are too far gone. The rest of their days will be lived in this, not just loneliness, but the shame of loneliness. Is that what is going on here? I fear it may be, and that is why this is the darkest of Emily Dickinson's poems. I tried to think a lonelier thing than any I had seen, some polar expiation, an omen in the bone of death's tremendous nearness. I probed retrieveless things, my duplicate to borrow, a haggard comfort springs from the belief that somewhere within the clutch of thought there dwells one other creature of heavenly love forgot. I plucked at our partition as one should pry the walls between himself and horror's twin within opposing cells. I almost strove to clasp his hand, such luxury. It grew that as myself could pity him, perhaps he pitied me.